The year was 1887. The sun over Arizona was a judgment, a flat, white heat that baked the ground as hard as iron. Reed Calhoun stood on the low hill overlooking the collection of shacks and false fronts they called Dust Hollow. The soil was stubborn, a mix of red clay and stone that resisted the shovel. He had dug the hole himself. It was the last thing he could do for Esther. Now, he just watched. The pine box was cheap. It was all the town had. The wood was already warping in the heat. Reverend Matthias, a man whose face looked like old leather left in the sun, spoke words from a book. The words meant nothing. They were just noise carried away by the dry wind, lost in the clicks of the grasshoppers and the endless, aching silence of the desert. There was no one else. Esther had been sick for months. The yellowjack had come up from the south, silent and swift, turning her skin to old parchment and her eyes to glass. The townspeople were afraid. Fear made good people cruel. They had left food on the porch of Reed's small rented room, but they had not come inside. They had not offered comfort, and they did not come to the burial. Reed felt nothing. That was the terror of it. He had spent every last bit of emotion watching her waste away. He had held her hand when the fever shakes took her, wiped her brow, listened to her beg for water when she could no longer swallow. He had seen the moment the light left her. What was left of him now was just a husk. The Reverend closed his book. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust. Reed picked up the shovel. The sound of the first clods of dry earth hitting the pine box was a final, terrible punctuation. He did not stop until the hole was filled. He did not stop until his hands were raw and split, the knuckles bleeding against the rough wood of the handle. He packed the earth down with his boots. He did not bother with a cross. The ground was marker enough. Reverend Matthias touched his shoulder. "She is with the Lord, son." Reed looked at the man's hand, then at his face. He said nothing. He turned and walked away, leaving the shovel and the old preacher by the mound of fresh, red dirt. Night did not bring relief. It just swapped the sun's fire for a vast, cold emptiness. Dust Hollow was alive in the dark. Tinny music spilled from the saloon, yellow light cutting into the street. Men were laughing. Reed walked past it all, his boots silent in the thick dust. He went to the livery. His horse, a tough bay gelding, whickered softly. Reed moved with mechanical purpose. He checked the horse's hooves. He brushed the animal down, his hands moving over the warm hide. It was the only living thing he had touched in days, besides Esther's cold skin. He saddled the horse, cinching the straps tight. He had a small saddlebag. Inside was a handful of jerky, a whetstone, and a spare box of cartridges for his revolver. He added nothing else. He walked back to the room he had shared with Esther. It smelled of sickness and lie. He looked at the narrow cot where she had died. He did not touch it. On the small table beside it was her handkerchief. It was plain linen, worn soft, with a small E stitched in the corner. He had given it to her 5 years ago. He picked it up. It held no scent of her, just the faint, chemical smell of the fever. He clenched it in his fist. His bleeding knuckles stained the fabric. He did not care. He put his key on the table. He blew out the lamp. He led the horse out of the livery. He mounted in one smooth, weary motion. His face, in the thin moonlight, was all shadow and hard angles. He did not look back at the lights of the saloon. He did not look back at the dark windows of the undertaker. He did not look back at the hill where the red earth was still new. He pointed the horse south, away from the town, away from the grave, and rode into the dark. He was cutting the last thread. There was nothing left in Dust Hollow for him. There was nothing left in him at all. He rode for 3 days, or maybe it was 4. Time blurred into a single, painful stretch of sun and dust. He rode through a country God had forgotten. The high desert of Arizona was a land of sharp edges and hostile life. Skeletons of saguaro cactus stood like tormented sentinels. Mesquite and palo verde clawed at the air, their leaves small and mean. He moved without purpose, He followed dry washes. He crossed flat, cracked alkali plains that shimmered in the heat. The world was bleached of color, reduced to red rock, brown earth, and a sky so vast and blue it felt like a weight. His bay gelding was a good horse. It kept on, but Reed paid it little mind, letting the reins hang loose. He was a rider adrift on a sea of dust. The sun hammered him. His lips cracked, his skin burned. The red dust coated him, filling his lungs, grating in his teeth. At night, the temperature plummeted. He would stop, not to sleep, but to collapse. He would build no fire. He would huddle in his thin blanket, the handkerchief still clutched in his hand, and stare at the cold, distant stars. The stars offered no answers. They just watched. He thought of Esther. He saw her face in the shimmering heat. He heard her voice in the wind, but it was not the voice of the woman he had married. It was the voice of the sickness, the frail, rasping whisper. He saw the yellow tinge of her skin, the hollows of her eyes. Grief was not a clean wound. It was a poison. It was a fever of its own. He ate the jerky without tasting it. His canteen grew light. The horse needed water. He needed water. But the need was dull, distant. Part of him did not care if he was found days later. A dried husk picked clean by buzzards. It would be an end. It would be quiet. On the fourth day, the horse stumbled. It was dehydrated, its head hanging low. The animal's suffering finally broke through Reed's stupor. He slid from the saddle, his own legs unsteady. He stroked the horse's dusty neck. "All right, boy," he whispered. His voice was a dry croak. "We'll find it. We'll find water." He scanned the horizon. It was all broken ridges and endless, sun-scorched plains. He saw a line of greener brush, willows and cottonwoods, perhaps snaking along the base of a low hill, a sign of a seep, or at least a place where water once ran. He grabbed the reins and began to walk, leading the horse toward the faint promise of life. The walk was agonizing. The ground was loose rock and sand. The sun felt like a physical blow on his back. He kept his head down, focused on putting one boot in front of the other. The horse labored behind him. He pushed through a tangle of dry, thorny bushes. He was not following a trail, just the logic of the land. Water would pool at the lowest point. He topped a small rise and stopped. It was not a seep, it was a house. A small log cabin, built sturdy and low, sat nestled against the side of the hill. It looked as if it had grown there. The wood was silvered with age. Thick, wild vines covered half the structure, their leaves a defiant green in the brown landscape. A porch ran the length of the front, deep in shadow. A stone chimney stood cold. No smoke rose into the still air. It seemed abandoned, a place of silence, a homestead lost to the drought or to violence. But it was intact. The roof was sound. A small, fenced corral stood empty to the side, and near it, a well, topped with a wooden bucket assembly. Water. Reed's thirst became a sudden, sharp command. He pulled the horse forward. He was halfway across the cleared dirt yard when a voice stopped him. "That's far enough." The voice was female. It was low and steady. It was not welcoming. Reed froze. He raised his hand slowly, away from his holster. He squinted at the porch. The shadows were deep. He had seen nothing. A figure stepped from the darkness. She was young, younger than him, perhaps. She wore a simple, faded calico dress. Her hair was pulled back in a severe bun, but stray strands framed a face that was taut with suspicion. Her eyes were the color of the dry grass. But it was not her face that held his attention. It was the rifle she held, a Winchester. She held it not with panic, but with familiar ease. The muzzle was pointed directly at his chest. "Ma'am," Reed said. His voice was thick with dust. "I mean no harm." "People who mean no harm usually stay on the trail," she said. Her voice was cold. "There ain't no trail here." "My horse," Reed said, gesturing with his chin. "He's done in. We need water. I saw the well." The woman, Clara May, did not lower the rifle. She studied him. She saw a man coated in red dust, his face gaunt and burned by the sun. She saw the exhaustion in his shoulders, the way he slumped even while standing. He looked dangerous, as all strangers did. But he also looked finished. He looked like he had been hollowed out. "You're alone?" she asked. "Just me." "What's your business in this part of the territory?" Reed hesitated. The truth felt raw, indecent, but it was all he had. "No business, ma'am. I just buried my wife. In Dust Hollow." The words hung in the hot, still air. The change in her was almost invisible. The rifle barrel did not waver, but something in her eyes, a flicker of hard recognition, softened the steel. She knew that particular brand of emptiness. She knew it well. "Sickness?" she asked. Her voice was flat. "Yellow Jack." She nodded once, a short, bitter acknowledgement. Clara May held the silence for another long moment. She was weighing the risk. A man was a danger. A man with a gun was a threat. But a man hollowed by grief was something else. He was a ghost. "The trough is behind the house," she said finally. "Water your horse? Take what you need for your canteen. Then move on." Reed nodded. "Thank you, ma'am. Obliged." He began to lead the horse toward the back. "Wait," she said. He stopped. She looked at the sky. The sun was tilting west, painting the high clouds in shades of bloody orange. It would be dark in less than 2 hours. The desert was unforgiving at night, especially to a man already half gone. "You can," she started, then paused, seeming to regret the words before she even spoke them. "You can take the porch for the night, just the porch. My husband's cot is still rolled up by the door." Reed looked back at her. Her face was set again, cold and distant. It was not an offer of comfort. It was a practical matter, a transaction. "I don't have money to pay," he said. "I'm not asking for money," she snapped. "I'm offering you a floorboard instead of a rock. Take it or leave it. But if you take it, your gun stays on the saddle." He nodded. It was a fair trade. He unbuckled his gun belt, the heavy Colt and the worn leather, and looped it over his saddle horn. He did it slowly, showing her his empty hands. She watched him, the rifle still ready. He led the horse to the trough and worked the pump handle. The sound of splashing water was the loudest thing in the yard. He let the horse drink deep, then filled his own canteen, the cool water hurting his throat as it went down. He tended to his horse, rubbing it down, giving it the last of his oats. When he was done, he walked to the porch. A rolled-up canvas cot lay against the wall. He picked it up and unrolled it. Clara May was gone. She had slipped back inside the house. The door was closed. He heard the metallic sound of a bar sliding into place. Reed sat on the cot. The wood of the porch was old, worn smooth in some places, splintered in others. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the desert released its heat with a sigh. The air grew cool, then cold. He was alone, but he was not. He was acutely aware of the woman inside the house. He could hear her moving, the scrape of a chair, the faint clink of a jar. He knew she was on the other side of that wooden door, probably sitting in the dark, listening. The rifle would be within reach. He was a threat to her. She was a mystery to him, but the space between them was filled with a shared, unspoken language. The silence of her house was not the silence of an empty place. It was the silence of a place holding its breath. It was the silence of loss. The wind picked up. It whispered through the dry leaves of the vines covering the porch. It sounded like voices. It sounded like Esther. He closed his eyes. Insects began their nightly chorus. A coyote yipped in the distance, its call answered by another. These were the only sounds, besides the creak of the old house settling and the sound of his own breathing. He did not lie down. He sat with his back against the cabin wall, his knees drawn up. He looked out at the land. The moon rose, bathing the yard in a pale, ghostly light. An hour passed. The door did not open. He did not move. Then he heard a sound, a muffled sob. It was sharp, quickly stifled. It came from inside. He tensed. He was an intruder on her grief, and she on his. They were two strangers bound by the same raw wound, separated only by a plank of wood. He sat still, listening to her quiet pain, until it faded back into the sounds of the desert. Clara May, on the other side of the door, heard him shift. She sat at her small table, the cold rifle across her lap. She had not lit the lamp. She knew this man, Reed Calhoun. She did not know his face, but she knew his state. She had lived it. Her husband, Silas, had been dead for 10 months, shot in the back over a piece of paper, a deed to this very land. The silence he left behind was loud. It was a ringing in her ears that never stopped. She heard the man on her porch. She heard the wind. She heard the insects. She glanced at the window. Through the imperfect glass, she saw his shape, a dark mass against the paler wood of the porch railing. They were two people, separated by a few inches of timber, trapped in the same vast loneliness. The night deepened. The moon climbed high, casting hard shadows. Reed thought the woman inside must be asleep. The house was utterly still. He was wrong. Clara May had not slept in a bed since Silas died. She slept in the chair by the door. She woke at every sound. She watched the shadows. Tonight, she watched the shadow on her porch. She rose from her chair, silent on her bare feet. She moved to the window, staying to the side where the moonlight would not catch her face. She looked out. Reed Calhoun had finally moved. He was not sleeping. He was sitting on the edge of the cot, his head in his hands. His shoulders were shaking. It was not a violent movement, but a deep, rhythmic tremor, the kind that comes from the very center of a man. He brought his hands up to his face. He was still clutching the faded white handkerchief. He held it to his mouth, trying to muffle the sounds he was making, but she could hear them. Low, guttural sobs, torn from his chest. He was crying. It was not a gentle weeping. It was the sound of a man breaking apart in the dark. He lowered the handkerchief and looked at his hands. Then his wrist. He turned his arm over in the moonlight. Clara May squinted. She saw it, a dark stain on the skin of his inner wrist. It was a dried patch of brown, dried blood. She watched as he rubbed at it. He scraped at the stain with his fingernail, his hand shaking so badly he could barely control it. He scrubbed, hard, a desperate, frantic motion. He was trying to erase it, trying to wipe away the last physical trace of the sickness, of the death he had witnessed. The sight of it made Clara's own throat tighten. She knew that desperation. She knew the need to scrub away the memory, the smell, the stain of death. After they brought Silas home, his shirt soaked red. She had tried to wash it. She had scrubbed until her own knuckles were raw, but the stain had remained. She watched Reed. He gave up scrubbing and just stared at his wrist, his whole body trembling. He was a man drowning, and he was 1,000 miles from any water. Clara stayed at the window. She did not move. She did not offer comfort. Comfort was a lie. There was no comfort for this. There was only enduring. She watched him, a silent witness, until the shaking subsided and he slumped back against the wall, a portrait of pure desolation. Reed awoke to the sound of metal on stone. The sun was already up. The air was cool and clear. His body ached. His back was stiff from the cot, his eyes gritty and swollen. He felt ashamed. He knew she must have heard him. He sat up and looked into the yard. Clara May was already at work. She was in the overgrown patch of ground that might have once been a garden. She was swinging a heavy pickaxe, breaking up the hard, dry soil. Weeds and thorny bushes had reclaimed the land. She was fighting them back. She moved with a grim, practiced efficiency. Her sleeves were rolled up, showing lean, strong forearms. The calico dress was dark with sweat at the back. She was not asking for help. She was simply doing what had to be done to survive. Reed stood up. He rolled the canvas cot neatly and placed it back against the wall. He walked down the porch steps. Clara heard his boots on the gravel but did not look up. She just swung the pickaxe, the blade striking the earth with a solid thud. He stood there for a moment, useless. He saw a second tool, a heavy hoe, leaning against the fence post. He walked over, picked it up. He did not ask permission. He started on the other side of the patch. The weeds were thick, their roots deep. He swung the hoe, cutting them at the base. The work was brutal. The sun was climbing, gaining its strength. His hands, already raw from the shovel, began to blister. He ignored the pain. The simple, mindless rhythm of the work was a relief. Chop, pull, toss. They worked in silence for more than an hour. The only sounds were the scrape and chop of the tools, their breathing, and the buzz of insects. Clara stopped. She wiped her brow with her forearm. She looked at him. Her eyes were clear, assessing. He stopped, too, breathing hard. "There's water in the bucket by the well," she said. Her voice was not kind, but it was not cold. It was just a statement of fact. "All right," he said. He walked to the well, pulled up the bucket, and drank deep from the dipper. The water was cold and tasted of minerals. He brought the dipper back, full, and held it out to her. She hesitated for only a second. Then she took it from his hand. Their fingers did not touch. She drank. She handed the dipper back. "The ground is too hard," she said, nodding at the patch. "Needs to be turned before the real heat sets in, or nothing will grow." "I've seen worse," Reed said. It was the first real conversation they had. She looked at the pile of weeds he had already cleared. He was a hard worker. He did not complain. "My name is Reed Calhoun," he said, holding the hoe. "I'm Clara May," she replied. She turned back to her work, lifting the pickaxe again. Reed turned back to his. They did not speak again for a long time, but they were no longer strangers. The silence had changed. It was no longer the silence of suspicion. It was the silence of work, a shared burden under the unforgiving Arizona sky. The distance between the porch and the yard had been crossed. A day turned into 2, then a week. Reed Calhoun did not leave. He had no destination, and the simple, brutal labor of the ranch was the only thing that kept the ghosts at bay. He moved like a shadow, his presence marked only by the work he left behind. He repaired the split rail fence that bordered the dry garden, his hands learning the feel of the rough-hewn wood, the jarring impact of the post driver. He hauled water from the deep well, the rope biting into his palms, the muscles in his back and shoulders screaming in protest, a good pain that drowned out the hollow ache in his chest. Clara May watched him. She said little. She provided food, cornbread and beans, salt pork when she had it. She would leave a plate on the porch railing. He would eat, wash the plate in the horse trough, and leave it by the door. It was a silent, functional arrangement. He slept on the cot, rose before the sun, and found work. The porch roof was leaking from a storm years past. He found old shingles in the lean-to barn, and, with a handful of bent nails he'd straightened one by one, he set about fixing it. He worked slowly, methodically. He was not working for her. He was working to keep himself from stopping. To stop moving was to let the thoughts rush in. The smell of the sick room, the sound of Esther's last, shallow breath. Clara, mending a flour sack in the shade of the porch, found her eyes drifting to him. He moved with a grim purpose. He was a man whittling himself down to nothing but bone and gristle and work. He was all sharp angles, his face hidden under the brim of his hat. He was a wound, walking. One evening, the heat finally broke. A faint breeze stirred the dust. They sat on the porch, 10 feet apart. She was shelling dried beans into a bowl, the thwack-thwack of the pod splitting the only sound. What was her name? Her voice was quiet, almost carried away by the wind. Reed went still. He had been staring at the horizon, watching the sky turn from bruised purple to black. He did not look at her. He waited so long she thought he would not answer. Esther, he said. The name felt strange on his tongue, like gravel. She was young. Clara stated it was not a question. He nodded, his throat tight. Younger than me, 22 years. Clara kept shelling. You were married long? 4 years. We came from Missouri. We thought the dry air would be good for her. She had a cough. He let out a breath, a short, bitter laugh. The air here ain't good for anything but buzzards. He fell silent. Clara waited. She knew this kind of talk. It came in pieces, like pulling teeth from dry ground. She liked the color blue, Reed said, his voice thick. Like the sky, back home, not this white-hot thing. He clenched his fist. I brought her here to die. The fever, Clara said, her hands still. It don't care where you're from. It just takes. It ate her, Reed whispered, the words ragged. It just ate her up, till there was nothing left. I held her hand and watched it happen. I watched her turn into a... He stopped. He could not say the word. Clara's hands resumed their rhythm. Thwack, thwack. And you blame yourself for it, for the sickness, for the sun, for God. Reed finally looked at her. Her face was in shadow, but he could feel the weight of her gaze. It was not pity. It was recognition. Don't you? He asked. Clara May set the bowl of beans aside. She looked at her own hands, resting in her lap. They were chapped, the knuckles scarred. My husband was named Silas. He built this house. He dug that well with his own 2 hands. He was strong. He was a good man. He didn't get sick. She paused, gathering the words. He got shot, right over there. She pointed into the darkness, toward the empty corral. About 10 months ago. Reed watched her, the shell of his own grief cracking, just enough to let another's in. A man from town, she continued, her voice flat, devoid of emotion, as if she were reciting a grocery list. A banker, Abel Granger. He wants this land. He wants all the land in this valley. Says the railroad is coming through. He offered Silas money. Not much. Pennies on the dollar. He said, Silas told him to go to hell. Told him this land was ours, paid for in sweat, and he'd not be run off by a man in a clean suit. She took a breath. Granger told him he'd be back, said Silas was making a mistake. A week later, Silas went out to check the horses. We only had 2 then. Heard a noise. I heard the shot. It was so loud. The whole world just stopped. I ran out. He was already gone. Shot in the back. She looked at Reed. Her eyes were dry. She had no tears left for this story. They said it was a drifter, a robbery gone wrong, but his wallet was still on him. His rifle was still in his hand, the sheriff in Dust Hollow. He's on Granger's payroll. Everyone is, so, yes, Mr. Calhoun, I blame Granger, I blame the sheriff, I blame the railroad, and on my worst nights, I blame Silas. I blame him for being so damn stubborn, for not just taking the money and getting us away from this godforsaken place. She stood up abruptly. I'm tired. Good night. She went inside, and he heard the familiar sound of the bar sliding into place. Reed sat alone in the dark, the air thick with their shared ghosts. His grief was a sickness. Hers was a murder. He was not sure which was worse. The sky was a sheet of brass for another week. The heat was a living thing, a predator that stalked the daylight hours. The ground cracked. The leaves on the vines shriveled. Reed's horse and Clara's bony mule stood listlessly in the shade of the lean-to. Then, one afternoon, the world changed. The sky turned a bruised, greenish yellow. The air became heavy, static. The wind, which had been a hot whisper, died completely. It was the silence before a war. Then came the first drops. They were not gentle. They were thick, heavy, splattering in the red dust like coins. Clara was inside, putting away the last of the mended sacks. She looked out the small, wavy-paned window. Reed was in the yard, tightening a hinge on the well-house door. The sky opened. It was not rain. It was a deluge. A gray wall of water slammed into the earth. The sound was a roar, a sudden, violent drowning of all other senses. Reed stopped working. He stood in the yard, stunned. He looked up at the sky, his hat quickly plastered to his head. The water streamed down his face. He was soaked to the skin in seconds. Clara watched, her hand on the door latch, ready to call him in. But he did not move toward the porch. Slowly, as if in a trance, Reed Calhoun pulled off his hat and threw it to the ground. The water flattened his hair, running in rivulets through the dust caked on his skin. He stood like that for a full minute, just letting it hit him. Then, his hands went to the buttons of his shirt. Clara's breath caught. She stepped back from the window, into the deeper shadows of the room, but her eyes were fixed on him. He tore the wet shirt open and pulled it from his shoulders, flinging it into the mud. The rain hammered his bare chest. He was thin, all ribs and sinew, but his skin was alive, turning red from the force of the downpour. He unbuckled his belt. His wet pants fell to his ankles. He kicked them away. He stood in the center of the yard, completely naked, exposed to the sky. Clara's heart was a drum against her ribs. She should have turned away. It was a violation to watch. It was a sin, but she was frozen. He was not celebrating. He was not mad. It was something else. It was an exorcism. He began to scrub at his skin. He used his fingernails, scraping at his arms, his chest, his face. He rubbed at his inner wrist, the same spot she had seen him clutch that first night. He was trying to wash something off, not the trail dust. He was trying to wash off the fever, the sickness, the death. He was trying to wash away the memory of Esther's skin, the smell of the room where she died, the stain of his own helplessness. He bent over, letting the water sluice over his back, his gasps lost in the roar of the storm. It was a desperate, primal, painful thing to see. A man trying to scour his own soul clean with mud and water. Clara stood in her dark, silent house, her hand pressed to her mouth. She was trembling. She felt a profound, aching pity that was so sharp it tasted like steel. It was mixed with something else, something hot and frightening. A connection to the raw, unprotected honesty of the man in the storm. She felt it in her own chest, a hollow space that suddenly, painfully, ached. He stood like that until the storm was as spent as he was. The rain eased, softened, and finally stopped. The world was dripping, the air suddenly cool and clean, smelling of wet earth and creosote. Reed Calhoun stood in the mud, shaking. The fervor had left him. He looked down at his clothes, scattered around him. He looked like a man waking from a nightmare. Slowly, painfully, he bent to pick them up, heavy and sodden with mud. He did not look at the house. He did not know she had seen. He gathered his things and walked, still naked, to the barn to find a rag. That night, the cold came. Reed was on his cot, wrapped in his one thin blanket. He had put on his only other pair of pants, but he was chilled to the bone. The bath in the storm had been a madness, a breaking. Now, the consequence was setting in. He started to shake. It began in his hands, then his legs, then his whole body. His teeth chattered so hard his jaw ached. He pulled the blanket tighter, but it was no good. The cold was inside him. It was the fever. He must have made a sound, a groan, or the rattle of his teeth. He heard the bar slide back on the door. Clara stood in the opening, a dark shape against the faint yellow light of the lamp inside. She held the lamp up. The light fell on him. She saw him, huddled, shaking, his face pale and tight with pain. "You're sick," she said. "It's just a chill," he chattered. "You're a fool," she said. It was not an insult. It was a fact. She stepped back. "Get inside, now!" He tried to stand, but his legs folded. He was weaker than he thought. She set the lamp down and came back. She grabbed his arm, pulling him up. "Lean on me." He was a heavy man, even thin. He draped an arm over her shoulders, and she put her arm around his waist. He was burning up. His skin was hot, even as he shook with cold. The contact was a shock to both of them. He smelled of rain and mud and sweat. She wrestled him inside, through the door, and into her small, clean cabin. There was one room, a table, a stove, and a bed. The bed was neatly made, covered with a quilt. It was Silas's bed. Her bed. She had not slept in it since he died. She slept in the chair, the rifle beside her. "Get in," she ordered, pushing him toward it. "I can't," he mumbled, his mind fogging. "Your bed. I'm dirty." "I don't care," she said, her voice sharp. "Get in before you fall." She helped him. He collapsed onto the quilt. He was still shaking violently. "Your clothes are wet," she said, her voice practical, but her hands were trembling. She did not wait for his permission. She worked at the buttons of his damp pants. Her fingers brushed his skin. He was too sick to react, too lost in the fever. She pulled the pants off him, leaving him in his underdrawers. She pulled back the quilt, pushed him under, and covered him to his chin. He was already sinking, his eyes closing. Clara went to the stove. She stoked the embers, added wood. She pumped water into a bowl, found a clean rag. She came back to the bed. She sat in the chair she usually slept in and placed it beside the bed. She dipped the rag in the cool water and laid it on his forehead. He sighed, a low, animal sound. She sat and watched him. The lamplight was low, casting shadows that danced on the log walls. This was the first time she had shared this room with a man since Silas, and this man was burning with fever, lost in his own private hell. She tended to him all night. She changed the rags. She held a cup of water to his lips, making him drink. He was pliant, almost childlike. The hardness, the shadow, was gone. He was just a sick man. Her gestures were simple. They were the same gestures she had used for Silas when he was sick, years ago. But they felt different. They were gentle. There was a tenderness in her hands that she could not, acknowledge. Sometime after midnight, he grew restless. The fever was high. He began to talk. He mumbled, tossing his head on the pillow. Esther, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Clara went still. "It's so hot," he whispered, his voice desperate. "The water, I couldn't. She was so thirsty. God, I'm sorry." He was crying. Not the violent sobs of the porch. These were weak, fevered tears that ran from the corners of his closed eyes into his hair. He was confessing, apologizing to the ghost in the room. It should have been me," he breathed. He reached out a hand, grasping at the empty air, at the ghosts he saw. Clara looked at his hand. It was scarred, calloused from the work, but it was shaking, vulnerable. She watched it for a long moment. Then, slowly, she put down the rag. She reached out her own hand and took his. His fingers closed around hers, a desperate, hot grip. He did not know who she was. He was holding onto a life raft. Clara May sat there, rigid. Her heart was pounding. She should pull away. This was not right. This was a betrayal. But his grip, it was the grip of a man at the very bottom of the ocean. She did not pull away. She sat in the chair, her hand in his, and listened to him apologize to his dead wife until the first gray light of dawn touched the window. When Reed awoke, the world was clear. The fever was gone. He felt weak, washed out, as if he'd been pulled through a knothole. But he was clear. The first thing he saw was the log ceiling. This was not the porch. He turned his head. Clara was asleep in the chair, her head slumped at an angle, her face softened by exhaustion, and her hand was still in his. Shame hit him like a physical blow. He let go of her hand, pulling his own back as if he'd been burned. The movement woke her. Her eyes snapped open, instantly alert. She saw him, awake, watching her. Her hand, still warm from his, fell to her lap. She flushed, a dark red that crept up her neck. Reed pushed himself up on his elbows. "Clara, ma'am, The fever broke," she said, standing up, her voice rough with sleep. She avoided his eyes. She went to the stove, busied herself with the coffee pot. "I apologize," Reed said. His voice was a croak. "I shouldn't have. I had no right in your bed." "You were sick," she said, her back to him. "You'd have died on the porch." "I'm sorry," he said again. He was ashamed of his weakness, of the rain, of the fever, ashamed of crying out for Esther in front of this woman, ashamed of holding her hand. Clara turned. She held the coffee pot, but she didn't pour. She looked at him. The hardness was gone from her face, replaced by a deep, profound weariness. "I needed someone to forget, too," she said, her voice so quiet he almost didn't hear it. Reed stared at her. It was a confession, tending to him. A living, breathing man in crisis had forced her to put her own ghosts aside. His fever had been a distraction from her grief. He had no answer for that. He got out of the bed. He was unsteady, but he stood. He found his clothes, still damp, folded on the floor. He dressed in silence, his back to her. He was back on the porch cot that night. He was weak, but he was alive. The air was cold, the desert chill sinking deep. He sat huddled in his blanket, staring out at the yard. Now a sea of mud. He had survived. He did not know if he was grateful. He heard the door open. He did not look. Clara came out. She was carrying the heavy wool quilt from her bed. She walked over to him. She did not speak. She sat on the cot, not close enough to touch, but not at the far end. She sat in the middle. She unfolded the quilt. She draped it over her own legs, then over his. It was large enough for both of them. They sat in the dark. The silence was thick, heavy. It was filled with everything they had not said. The fever, Esther, Silas, the touch of their hands. Reed felt the warmth of her. A few inches away, he felt the shared heat under the blanket. He could smell the faint scent of wood smoke and lie from her. He shifted, just an inch, to pull the quilt higher on his shoulder. His shoulder brushed hers. It was a small, simple contact, wool against wool, but underneath, it was skin, it was warmth, it was life. Reed froze. Clara froze. Neither of them moved away. They sat there, on the porch, under a single blanket, their shoulders touching, and watched the moon rise over the broken land. The fever broke, but it left a new kind of silence. The night they had shared the quilt on the porch, their shoulders touching, had changed the air. It was a line drawn in the dust, and now they were both on the other side of it. Reed was back on his cot. Clara was back in her chair by the door, but the barrier of the cabin wall was gone. They were intensely aware of each other. The small cabin was no longer big enough to hold both their griefs and this new, unspoken thing. The work continued. It was all they had. They moved in the garden, clearing the last of the stubborn roots. The silence, once a neutral space of shared labor, was now charged. It was filled with the things they did not say. It started with their hands. When Reed reached for the hoe, his knuckles brushed the back of her hand. A jolt, like static in the dry air, passed between them. He pulled his hand back quickly. She pretended not to notice, but a faint color rose on her neck. Later, he passed her the dipper from the water bucket. Their fingers met on the smooth wood of the handle. This time, neither pulled away at once. His fingers were calloused and rough. Hers were chapped and strong. Their hands held the dipper between them for one long, suspended second. It was just water, but it felt like a promise. Their eyes followed. He found himself watching her. He watched the way she pushed stray hairs back from her face, her forearm smudged with dirt. He watched the set of her jaw as she wrestled a stubborn rock from the earth. He was watching her not as a widow, not as a stranger, but as Clara. She watched him. She saw the way his shirt pulled tight across his back when he lifted the axe. She saw the sadness that settled in his eyes when he stopped working and stared at the horizon, his thoughts 100 miles away, buried on a hill near Dust Hollow. She saw the man, not just the grief. The looks they shared grew longer. They were no longer the brief, guarded glances of two strangers. They were deep, questioning. They were looks that asked, "Do you feel this too?" And they were looks that answered, "Yes, and it frights me to death." They ate their suppers on the porch, as always. But now, the 10 feet of space between them felt like a canyon, and also like no space at all. He could smell the soap on her skin. She could hear the quiet rhythm of his breathing. The tension was a third person, sitting with them, waiting. One evening, the heat held on long after the sun had set. The air was thick, suffocating. A storm was building to the south, but it would not break, offering no relief. They had finished a meager meal. Clara stood to clear the plates. She picked up the water bucket, intending to dash the last of it on the dusty porch boards to cool the air. She stumbled. Perhaps it was the uneven plank, perhaps just weariness. The bucket tipped. The water, a precious gallon, splashed down the front of her. She let out a short, sharp gasp. The shock of the cool water and the stifling heat made her shiver. Reed looked up. The faded, worn calico of her dress was plastered to her body. It was a thin, cheap fabric, washed so many times it was almost translucent. It clung to her. It hid nothing. The curve of her waist, the shape of her legs, the clear, hard outline of her breasts. Her nipples peeked from the cold water. Reed's breath hitched. He saw her. He saw the woman, a living, breathing, warm woman. His first instinct was a violent, lurching guilt. It was a betrayal. He was looking at another woman, and Esther was only weeks in the ground. He tore his eyes away. He turned his head, staring hard into the blackness of the yard. His jaw clenched so tight it ached. He gripped the edge of the porch bench, his knuckles white. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the drip of water from her dress onto the floorboards. Clara stood there, shivering. She saw him look, and she saw him turn away. She saw the rigid line of his back, the rejection. It was a pain sharper than any she had felt in months. It was a confirmation of her deepest fear, that she was nothing, that she was undesirable, a ghost herself, existing only in Silas's cold house. But then she looked again. She saw the tension in his shoulders. She saw the trembling in the hand that gripped the bench. That was not indifference. It was a fight. He was fighting his own desire, fighting his own guilt. He was not rejecting her. He was rejecting himself. She understood. His pain was not so different from hers. He was trapped by a ghost, just as she was. She did not retreat into the house. She did not cover herself. She took a step closer to him. He heard the wet slap of her bare foot on the wood. He did not turn. "Reed," she said. Her voice was low, unsteady. He remained rigid, his back to her. She took another step. She was close enough now to feel the heat radiating from his body. She could smell the day's sweat on him, a scent of salt and dry dust. "If you are hurting," she said, her voice so choked it was barely a whisper. She was terrified. Her whole body was shaking, and not just from the cold. Her eyes were wide, glistening in the faint starlight. "Then just let me touch you." It was not a seduction. It was a plea. It was an offering. She was in pain. And she saw his, and in that moment, the only medicine they had was each other. Reed turned his head slowly. He looked at her. He saw the water dripping from her hair. He saw the tremble in her lips. He saw the raw, aching loneliness in her eyes that mirrored his own. She was not Esther. She was not a replacement. She was Clara, and she was offering him a way to feel something other than the crushing weight of what he had lost. He did not speak. He raised a hand, his own hand shaking, and touched her cheek. His calloused fingers were rough against her wet skin. She closed her eyes, leaning into his touch, a sound escaping her, half sob, half sigh. That was all. The dam broke. He surged up from the bench. He did not kiss her. He crashed into her. His mouth found hers in the dark, and it was not gentle. It was a collision of hunger and grief. It was desperate and angry and raw. It was the kiss of two people who had forgotten what it meant to be alive. His hands tangled in her wet hair, gripping her head as if he were drowning and she were the last piece of solid ground. She kissed him back with the same force, her arms wrapped around his neck, pulling him closer, her fingers digging into his shoulders. This was not comfort. This was a rebellion. A rebellion against the graves they had dug, against the silence, against the God-forsaken land that had taken everything from them. They kissed under the canopy of endless, cold stars. And for a minute, they were not two lonely people. They were one shared, desperate need. He broke the kiss, breathing hard, his forehead pressed against hers. They were both shaking. Neither spoke. There were no words for this. He took her hand. His grip was tight, almost painful. He pulled her, not gently, toward the cabin door. She went. She did not hesitate. Inside, the cabin was dark, suffocating. He let go of her hand only to find the lamp. He struck a match. The flame sputtered, then caught, casting a low, yellow light over the small room. They stood staring at each other. Her dress was still clinging. His face was a mask of pain and a desire so fierce it was frightening. Slowly, his hands moved to the front of her dress. His fingers were clumsy, shaking as they fumbled with the small, worn buttons. He was not practiced. He was terrified. He was undone. Clara watched his face as he worked. When he got the last button, he pushed the wet fabric off her shoulders. The dress pooled at her feet in a wet heap. She stood before him in her thin, mended chemise. Her own hands, just as unsteady, came up to his shirt. She unbuttoned it, her fingers brushing the skin of his chest. He was hot. He was real. She pushed the shirt from his shoulders, her hands mapping the sinew and bone. They moved with a strange, fumbling urgency. Hesitant hands, hungry hands, hands that were clumsy from disuse, yet desperate with need. He unlaced his boots, kicking them aside. She helped him with his belt. He unfastened his pants. She pulled the chemise over her head. They stood naked in the dim lamplight. They saw each other's scars. They saw the thinness from hunger. They saw the marks of labor. They saw the humanity. He lifted her. She was light. He carried her the 2 steps to the bed, Silas's bed, the bed she had not slept in for 10 months. They fell onto the mattress. There were no words of love, no sweet promises. It was a raw, aching coupling. It was a search for oblivion. It was hands gripping, teeth grazing, bodies moving together in a rhythm that was not about pleasure, but about existence. It was a frantic, necessary act, a desperate attempt to use the body to silence the mind. It was a clawing, gasping, urgent confirmation that they were, despite everything, still alive. Afterward, they lay in the dark. The lamp had burned out. They did not touch. They lay side by side, staring at the log ceiling, listening to the sound of each other's breathing. The silence that returned was heavier than any that had come before. It was the silence of a thing done that could not be undone. They had not found comfort. They had only found a brief, violent release. They had survived the night, but now the dawn was coming. The next morning, Reed was gone from the bed before the sun was up. Clara awoke alone. The dent of his head was still on the pillow next to hers. She lay there, her body aching, a cold knot of dread in her stomach. She found him by the woodpile, splitting logs with a savage, punishing rhythm. The axe rose and fell, the crack of the wood splitting the morning stillness. He had already stacked a cord of wood. He was working himself to exhaustion, trying to sweat out the sin. She didn't say good morning. She just said, "The coffee is on." He did not look at her. He just nodded once, sank the axe into the chopping block, and wiped his face on his sleeve. The days that followed were a quiet, terrible agony. The shared looks were gone, replaced by a careful avoidance. They moved around each other. Two planets knocked from their orbits. The intimacy had built a wall. They no longer sat on the porch together. He ate his meals by the corral. She ate hers standing by the cold stove. He slept on the cot. She slept in her chair. The bed went unused. The jealousy came first. It was a strange, sideways thing. He saw her staring at the empty corral, and he felt a flash of anger at Silas, the dead man who still owned her. She would see him clutching the linen handkerchief, Esther's, and she would feel a hot, bitter resentment for the ghost he still loved. The confusion was constant. He had betrayed his wife. She had betrayed her husband. And for what? A moment of animal need that left them emptier than before. The fear was worst. They had broken the one unspoken rule. They had let the outside world in the most intimate way, and now they did not know who they were to each other. After 3 days of this brittle, aching silence, Clara could not bear it any longer. She found him by the well, pulling up a bucket. He moved to let her pass, as if she were a stranger. "Reed," she said. He stopped, but he did not look at her. He kept his grip on the rope. She had to ask. The not knowing was eating her alive. "If you still love your wife," she said, her voice small, her hands twisting in her apron. "If you still—" She swallowed. "Then what am I?" It was the one question he could not answer. He did still love Esther. The grief was a part of his bones. What he felt for Clara was something different. It was need. It was companionship. It was a desperate, confusing desire. But it was not the simple, clean love he had felt for his wife. He did not know what it was. To tell her she was just a comfort would be to break her. To lie and say he loved her would be to betray Esther and himself. He had no words. Reed Calhoun stood there, the rope biting into his hands. He looked at the ground. He looked at the sky. He looked at the endless, unforgiving horizon. He could not look at her. He turned, leaving the bucket hanging, and walked away. Clara watched him go, his back straight and rigid. His silence was the answer. It was the cruelest answer he could have given. She was nothing. She was a mistake. She wrapped her arms around herself, a coldness settling in her chest that had nothing to do with the weather. The standoff lasted for 2 more days. They were trapped. They were 2 people in a small boat, having thrown the oars overboard. And now they were just drifting, waiting for the storm. It came on the 3rd day. It was not a storm. It was a man. He rode in on a horse that was too fine for this part of the country, a sleek black gelding. The man himself was not a cowboy. He wore a dark suit, dusty from the trail, and a derby hat. He had a clean-shaven, pale face, but his eyes were hard. He wore a holstered pistol, high on his hip. He reined in at the edge of the yard, his eyes taking in everything: the mended fence, the cleared garden patch, the mule, Reed's bay, and Reed, who had stepped out from the barn, his hand resting near his own holster. The stranger ignored Reed. He looked at Clara, who had come to the porch, her rifle held loosely at her side. He tipped his derby. His smile was thin, polite. "Mrs. Silas May?" "Who's asking?" Clara's voice was steady. "Name's Harlan Pike. I'm an associate of Mr. Abel Granger." from the bank in Dust Hollow. The name hung in the air. Reed went still. This was the man who had killed her husband. Mr. Granger sends his warmest regards. Pike continued, his voice smooth. He was wondering if, after all this time for reflection, you might have reconsidered his very generous offer for this parcel of land. My answer is the same as my husband's, Clara said, her voice cold as iron. It's not for sale. Pike's smile did not waver. That's a pity, a real pity. Progress is coming to this valley. Mrs. May, the railroad. It's a fine thing. It brings commerce. It brings civilization. It's not a thing you can, or should, stand in the way of. I'm not standing in the way of anything, Clara said. I'm standing on my land. Pike chuckled. A dry, unpleasant sound. Land's a funny thing, ma'am, especially out here. Sometimes it's worth more to the future than it is to the past. His gaze slid, for the first time, to Reed. He looked him up and down, taking in the worn clothes, the gun, the protective stance. Got yourself a new hand, I see, Pike said. Good help is hard to find. It's even harder to keep. The threat was unmistakable. It hung in the hot, dry air. Pike tipped his hat again. Mr. Granger will be disappointed to hear you're not reasonable. He asked me to tell you to think on it. Think hard on what it costs to hold on to things that don't want to be held. He turned his horse in a neat circle, his eyes lingering on Reed for one final, cold moment. Then he rode away, his back straight, leaving a trail of dust. Reed and Clara stood in the yard, 50 feet apart. The stranger was gone, but the illusion of their isolation was shattered. The outside world, the world of bankers and murderers, had found them. The shared danger was a new, unwelcome bond. But the question Clara had asked, "What am I?" still hung between them, unanswered, more dangerous than any man with a gun. The visit from Harlan Pike changed nothing, and it changed everything. The raw, broken silence between Reed and Clara, born of their night together and her unanswered question, now had a new, sharper edge. The world was no longer just the two of them, trapped in their separate pasts. The past had a name, Abel Granger, and it was riding toward them with a deed in one hand and a gun in the other. Reed was a coil, wound too tight. He could not work. He could not sit still. He just paced the yard, from the well to the corral, his hand never far from the butt of his revolver. He watched the horizon. He was a man waiting for a war. Clara watched him. His silence was worse than the yelling had been. He had not answered her. He had not told her what she was. And now, this new threat had given him an excuse to remain a stranger. After a day of this, he could not stand it. He had to move. I'm riding out, he said, his voice clipped. He was already saddling the bay. Clara came out onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. Where? You're not going after that man. That's what he wants. I'm going to Dust Hollow. Reed said, I'm going to the saloon. I'm going to listen. Listen for what? The sound of the shot? To find out what we're standing against. He looked at her, his face hard, the old hollow-eyed grief replaced by a cold anger. He threatened you. He threatened this place. I won't just sit here and wait for him to come back. He mounted and rode out before she could say another word. He did not look back. Dust Hollow was suffocating in the midday heat. The street was empty. He tied the bay in front of the saloon, the same saloon he had walked past on the night he left. He pushed through the bat-wing doors. The inside was dark, smelling of stale beer and sawdust. A few men were at the bar. He recognized none of them. He bought a whiskey and took a table in the back corner, the one that gave him a view of the door and the street. He nursed the drink, letting the burn settle in his stomach. He just listened. The talk was of the heat, the cattle prices, the drought. Then, a man in a dusty suit at the bar lowered his voice. Heard Granger closed on the Miller Ranch. Got it for 10 cents on the dollar. The bartender, a burly man with a stained apron, just grunted. Miller was smart to sell. Can't fight the railroad. It ain't the railroad buying, the man said. It's Granger. He's bought up this entire valley, every patch with water. Now, word is, the railroad's got to come through the North Pass, and they'll have to pay Granger's price for every drop of water for the steam engines. He'll be a king, the bartender said. He already is, the man muttered. He's buying up land the railroad don't even need, like that patch up on the ridge, the old Calhoun claim. Reed's hand tightened around his glass. Why's he want that? The bartender asked. It's dry, worthless. Who knows how a banker's mind works? Maybe he just likes owning things. Or maybe he's just cleaning house, making sure no one's left to complain. Reed put a coin on the table and stood up. He walked out of the saloon. He knew where he had to go. The room he had rented with Esther was still there. The key was still on the hook by the landlady's door. He took it. He did not ask permission. He opened the door. The air was thick, still. It smelled of dust and lye and sickness. The cot where she had died was still against the wall. He felt a wave of nausea. He had run from this place. Now, he had to walk back into it. A small wooden box was under the cot. It held her things. He had not been able to look at it. He had not been able to touch it. He sat on the dusty floor, pulled the box out, and opened it. Inside, there was a ribbon she used to tie her hair, a tintype of her, smiling, back in Missouri, a few letters from her mother, and a small, cloth-bound book, a diary. He had not known she kept one. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely open it. He found the last entries. The handwriting was thin, spidery, the words of a woman lost in fever. He turned back, weeks earlier, back to when the sickness had just begun, when her mind was still clear. March 3rd, Mr. Abel Granger came by today. Reed was out, trying to find work hauling freight. Mr. Granger brought oranges. He was a perfect gentleman. He said he was sorry to hear of my illness. He said this land was no place for a sick woman. He offered to buy our claim. He said it was not worth much, but he would give us $200, enough to get home to Missouri. Reed's blood turned to ice. He read on. March 10th, Mr. Granger returned. Reed was gone. I told him we were not selling. He did not smile this time. He looked at my medicine bottle. He said, "The doctor charges a high price, Mrs. Calhoun. It would be a tragedy if your husband's pride left you without comfort in your time of need." Reed felt the blood pounding in his temples. He flipped the pages, his hands tearing at them. March 12th. I told Reed. He was angry. He went to see Mr. Granger, but the banker told him he had misunderstood, that he was only offering charity. Reed came back, and he was ashamed. He said he was failing me. He said maybe we should sell. I told him no. I will not be run off. March 20th. The fever is worse. Doctor, Evans came. He gave me something new. It tastes bitter. It makes me sleep. But I have bad dreams. Then, the last clear entry. It was written in a frantic, shaky hand. April 2nd. I saw him. Through the window. Mr. Granger. He was with Dr. Evans by the stable. He gave the doctor money. A lot of money. The doctor tried to refuse. Mr. Granger grabbed his arm. I heard him. He said, "A quick end is a merciful end, and a silent one is a profitable one." The doctor came inside. He had a new bottle. He said it was from the city. He said I must take it. I told Reed. I told him what I saw. He looked at me. He looked so sad. He told the doctor I was delirious. The doctor nodded. He said the fever was in my head. They think I am mad. Reed dropped the book. It fell into the dust. He stared at the cot. He saw Esther, pale, her eyes wide with a fear he had mistaken for madness. He had held her hand. He had given her the medicine. He had told her to rest, that the fever was making her see things. Granger had not just let her die. He had not just threatened her. He had murdered her. He had paid the doctor to poison her, all for a worthless piece of land on a ridge, just a clean house. His grief, which had been a hollow, aching void, was suddenly filled with a black, searing rage. He had not been grieving a sickness. He had been grieving a murder, his own wife's murder. He grabbed the diary, shoved it into his shirt, and ran from the room. He rode the bay into the ground, pushing the animal until its flanks were white with foam. When he reached the ranch, he did not stop. He rode straight into the yard, leaping from the saddle before the horse had even stopped. Clara was on the porch. She saw his face and took a step back. This was not the man who had left. This was someone she had never seen. "Reed, what is it? What's wrong?" "We're leaving," he said, his voice a low, terrible growl. He stalked onto the porch, grabbing her arm. "Now, pack what you can carry." "What? I'm not—" "He murdered her," he roared, his control shattering. He slammed his fist against the porch post. The wood groaned. "Esther, he paid the doctor to poison her, to get our land, a worthless piece of land. He killed her just to be tidy." He pulled the diary from his shirt and threw it at her. "He killed her, and he killed Silas, and he will kill you. All for this damn dirt." Clara's face was white. She looked at the book, then back at his wild eyes. "Reed, He'll send Pike back," Reed went on, pacing, his hands balled into fists. "Or he'll send someone worse. We can't fight him. Clara, he's a banker. He has the law. He has the doctors. He has all the money in the world. We have nothing. We have this shack. We have to run." "No," she said. The word was quiet, but it cut through his rage. "What did you say?" He spun on her. "I said no." She stood up, her own anger rising. "He killed my husband. He murdered your wife. And you want to run." "I want to live," he shouted, getting in her face. "What good is dying? You want to be brave? You want to stand here with that rifle until they put a bullet in your back, just like Silas? Is that what you want?" "It's better than running," she cried, shoving him back. "This is my home. Silas built it. He died for it. I will not let that man have it." "It's not a home. It's a box. It's a grave," he yelled. You're just waiting here to die. You're haunting this place, and you're dragging me down with you." "And what are you?" she screamed, tears of fury in her eyes. "You're a ghost. You've been a ghost since the day you got here. You talk about him killing Esther. You left her alone. You left her with a doctor you didn't trust. You let him—" She stopped, her hand flying to her mouth, her eyes wide with horror at what she had said. The world went silent. The only sound was the wind, whistling in the eaves. Reed stood as if she had struck him with an axe. The rage drained from his face, leaving it a sickly, pale mask. He just stared at her. The truth of her words was a poison, more effective than any the doctor had used. "Reed," she whispered, her hands shaking. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean—" "Yes, you did," he said. His voice was dead. He had no more anger left. He had nothing. "You're right. I did. I left her. I believed them. I did it." He looked around the yard, at the porch, at her. "He already won," he whispered. "He took her. He's going to take this. He's going to take everything." He turned his back on her. He walked off the porch, his shoulders slumped. He walked to the barn, went inside, and did not come out. Night fell. The fight had broken them. It had said every terrible, true thing that they had hidden in the silence. Clara sat in the cabin, the diary on her lap. She had read it. She wept for Esther. She wept for Reed. She wept for herself. The anger was gone, leaving only a cold, deep dread. He was right. Granger would win. The house was too small. The air was too thick. She couldn't breathe. She lit a candle and put it on the table. She took off her heavy, sweat-stained dress. She pulled on her nightgown. It was the only other thing she had. It was old, white cotton, washed so thin it was almost sheer. She went outside, The air was cool, but the porch felt no safer. She stood, leaning against the post, looking out into the impenetrable dark. The candlelight spilled from the open door behind her, outlining her body in a faint, trembling glow. She was a picture of anxiety. Her arms wrapped around her waist, her face pale and tracked with tears. She was just waiting. From the darkness of the barn, Reed saw her. He had been sitting in the hayloft, his revolver in his lap, trying to find the courage to ride away, to run, just as she'd accused him of doing. But he saw her, standing there, a thin white ghost against the dark, lit from behind. He could see the shape of her legs, the curve of her hip, her breasts rising and falling with her anxious breaths. She looked small. She looked breakable. She was not the hard woman who had held a rifle on him. She was not the angry woman who had screamed the truth at him. She was just Clara, and she was terrified. His own shame was a heavy weight, but the sight of her, it was heavier. He left the barn, his boots making no sound in the soft dust. She heard the creak of the porch step. She gasped, spinning, her hand flying to her throat. She thought it was Pike. "It's me," Reed said. His voice was low. She turned back around, her shoulders rigid, her back to him. She could not face him, not after what she had said. He walked up behind her. He stood so close he could feel the tremor running through her. He could smell the lie from her skin, the fear. His own hands were shaking. He wanted to comfort her. He wanted to apologize. He wanted to run. Instead, he just raised his hands and put them on her waist. She flinched, a sharp intake of breath, but she did not pull away. He felt the thin cotton, the warmth of her skin beneath. He slid his hands around her, pulling her back against his chest. He hooked his chin over her shoulder, holding her tight. She was trembling like a leaf. "You don't have to be strong in front of me," he whispered, his voice rough. "You don't have to be strong for even one more minute." That was all it took. A sob tore out of her, a sound of such complete and total despair that it cracked his own broken heart. She sagged against him, her hands coming up to grip his forearms. "He's going to kill us, Reed," she wept, her voice muffled against his shirt. "He's going to come back, and he's going to kill us both." "I know," he said, his arms tightening, holding her as if he could keep the world away. "I'm so tired of being scared," she whispered. "I know." He turned her slowly in his arms. Her face was a ruin, wet with tears, her eyes wide and luminous in the candlelight. He looked at her, and the fight, the anger, the ghosts, they all fell away. There was only this woman, this moment. He bent his head. He did not kiss her mouth. He kissed the tears from her cheek. He kissed her temple. He kissed her closed, trembling eyelids. "Clara," he breathed. Her hands came up, not to push him away, but to hold his face. Her fingers dug into his stubble. She pulled his mouth to hers. This was not the raw, hungry collision of the first time. This was slow. This was tender. This was a goodbye. It was a kiss that said, "We are going to die, but we will not die alone." Her lips were soft, tasting of salt and fear. His were chapped, tasting of dust and regret. They held the kiss, and it was a quiet, desperate prayer in the dark. He lifted her. She wrapped her legs around his waist, her arms around his neck, burying her face in his shoulder. He carried her inside, into the flickering light of the single candle. He laid her on the bed. They undressed each other slowly, their hands memorizing. This was not about lust. It was about solace. His fingers traced the line of her collarbone. Her hands cupped his rough, scarred face. They came together not with passion, but with a profound, aching tenderness. It was slow. It was deliberate. It was the only comfort they had left to give. He moved inside her, watching her face in the dying light, and he saw his own fear reflected there. Their lips found each other, again and again, in a constant, searching kiss. as if they could breathe life into each other, as if they could hold back the morning. They held on. Two broken people, finding a last, desperate peace in the ruins of their lives, the candlelight flickering on their bare skin, until it finally burned itself out and left them in the dark. When dawn came, Reed was awake. He had not slept. He had just held her, listening to her breathe. He knew what she had said was true. He had failed Esther. He had run. He looked at Clara's face, peaceful in sleep, and he knew he could not run again. He could not fail her. Too. He slid from the bed. He dressed quietly. He strapped on his gun belt. He picked up Esther's diary. Clara stirred, her eyes opening. She saw him, armed, the diary in his hand. She sat up, pulling the sheet to her chest. "Where are you going?" "Dust Hollow." Her face went pale with panic. "To find him? Reed, no, he'll kill you." "I'm not going to find him," Reed said. His voice was calm. The rage was gone, burned away, leaving a core of cold, hard steel. "I'm going to the courthouse. I'm going to the magistrate. I'm going to tell him a banker named Abel Granger murdered my wife." "He owns the town," she whispered, the same words he had shouted at her. "They'll laugh at you, or they'll arrest you, or they'll just shoot you in the street." "Maybe," Reed said. He tucked the diary inside his shirt. "I don't care. I spent months running from her ghost because I thought I was to blame. But he's the one who killed her. I'm not running anymore. I'm not doing it for me. I'm not even doing it for her. I'm doing it because it's the only thing left to do." He was doing it for both of them. To protect Clara, he had to get justice for Esther. The two women, the dead and the living, were now bound by the same man. He walked to the door. "Reed," she called. Her voice was strong. He turned. She was standing by the bed, the sheet wrapped around her. "I'll wait," she said. She took a breath, her chin high. "Or I'll come with you. I'll stand with you." He looked at her. The woman who had been a sheer, trembling ghost on the porch last night was gone. In her place was the woman who had held a rifle on him, the woman who had refused to run. "You wait here," he said. "Keep the rifle loaded, and bar the door." He walked out onto the porch, into the bright, clean morning light. He mounted his horse. He did not look back. He pointed the bay toward Dust Hollow, a man with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. Reed rode for a mile before he realized he was not alone. He heard the sound of a second horse, a steady, loping gait that was not an echo. He reined in and turned, his hand dropping to his holster. Clara May pulled her bony mule to a stop 20 yards away. She was wearing her plain calico dress, but she had a man's hat pulled low, and the Winchester was resting in a scabbard by her knee. A small, tightly packed bundle was tied behind her saddle. "I told you to wait," Reed said, his voice hard. "You told me to bar the door," she replied, her own voice just as steady. "You didn't say which side."
"This ain't your fight, Clara. This is about Esther."
"He murdered your wife to get a piece of land," she said, urging the mule forward until she was beside him. "He murdered my husband for another. He sent a man to threaten me, on my own porch. It stopped being just about Esther or just about Silas the minute that man rode into my yard." She looked at him, her eyes clear. The fear from the night before burned away. "It's our fight, Reed. Whether we like it or not, I'm not waiting in that cabin to be a victim. I'm riding with you." He looked at her for a long moment. He saw the set of her jaw. He saw the way her hand rested on the stock of the rifle. He was not leading a woman to her doom. He was riding with a partner. He nodded once. "All right, let's go." They rode into Dust Hollow as the sun climbed high, turning the street to a white, dusty glare. They rode side by side, Reed, tall and grim on his bay, Clara, straight-backed and unblinking on her mule. They were a strange, hard-bitten pair, and the town noticed. The whispers started before they had even tied their horses. Women, sweeping the boardwalks in front of the dry goods store, stopped. They looked at Clara, at her worn dress, at the rifle. They saw the man beside her, a man who was not her husband. They saw the way they moved together, not touching, but bound by an invisible string. The women's eyes were cold. They were looks of judgment. A widow, not even a year in mourning, riding into town with a stranger. They whispered the word shameless. Men, leaning back in their chairs in the shade of the saloon, watched them. They saw Clara's form. They saw the hard-eyed man with her. Their smirks were ugly. They saw something else. They saw a fallen woman. Reed felt the eyes on them. He saw the women turn their backs. He saw the men nudging each other. He looked at Clara. Her face was pale, but she kept her chin high. She stared straight ahead, as if she were walking through a gauntlet of snakes, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her flinch.
Let them talk,
Reed said, his voice low. They've been talking since the day Silas died, she said. They're just talking louder now. They did not go to the magistrate. They went to the only lawyer in town whose shingle did not look brand new, a man named Amos Pritchard. His office was a single, dusty room above the telegraph exchange. Pritchard was an old man, his waistcoat stained with tobacco. He listened. He read the diary. He looked at the two of them, his gaze sharp and weary. This is a terrible story, son, he said, handing the diary back to Reed. And this, he tapped the book, is a woman's heartache. It's not evidence. She saw Granger give the doctor money. Reed insisted. She heard what he said, a merciful end. Hearsay, Pritchard said, shaking his head. And from a woman, forgive me, Mrs. May, who was addled with the fever. That's what Dr. Evans will say.
Where is he?
Reed demanded.
Where is Evans?
Left town, Pritchard said. 2 months back. Said he was going to California. No one knows where. He ran, Clara said. Or he was paid to. Pritchard sighed. He leaned back. Look, you're talking about Abel Granger. This man is Dust Hollow. He owns the bank. He owns the sheriff. He owns the land office. You're asking me to accuse him of murder, based on the diary of a sick woman and the word of another woman he's trying to run off her land. So you won't help us, Reed said. It was not a question. I'm saying, if you walk into that courthouse with what you have, you'll be the one in jail for defamation, or you'll be the one in the street, dead. Granger doesn't play games. I'm an old man. I'd like to stay one. He showed them the door. They stood on the boardwalk, the sun hammering down. The whispers seemed louder now. He's scared, Clara said.
He's smart,
Reed countered, his voice bitter. The law's a dead end, just like I told you. So what now? She asked. Now, we get a room at the boarding house. We can't ride back tonight. We're here. We let him know we're here. We let him make the next move. They rented a single room. The landlady, a woman with a face like a sour apple, looked at Clara, then at Reed, then at the single key. That'll be $2, in advance. Her disapproval was a physical thing. The room was small, hot, and smelled of stale linens. There was one bed. They did not speak of it. They were comrades in a war. The bed was just a place to rest. Reed left as the sun began to set. I'm going to find out what else I can. Listen at the saloon. See who else Granger has run over. There has to be someone else. I'll come with you, Clara said, reaching for her rifle.
No, a woman in a saloon will just cause a different kind of trouble. Stay here. Lock the door. Put the chair under the knob. I'll be back in an hour.
He left. Clara barred the door. She sat on the lumpy bed, the Winchester across her lap, and she waited. Reed never made it to the saloon. He cut through the alley behind the dry goods store, a shortcut to the main street. It was deep in shadow, the sun already behind the false fronts. That's the man, Harlan. The voice came from in front of him. Harlan Pike stepped out from behind a stack of barrels. He had a smile on his face, the same thin, polite smile he'd worn at the ranch. Reed's hand went to his gun. "I wouldn't," a second voice said from behind. Reed felt the cold, round muzzle of a revolver press into the back of his neck. A second man, big and burly, had stepped out from a doorway. "Mr. Granger is a businessman. Calhoun," Pike said, walking closer. He was not smiling anymore. "He prefers to settle things quietly. He made you a good offer on your land. He tried to warn your wife. He made misses. Made a very fair offer. But you're not reasonable. You've come to town. You've hired a lawyer. You're upsetting the peace."
"You mean I'm upsetting his profits?"
Reed growled.
"That, too."
Pike nodded to the man behind Reed. Reed never had a chance to draw. The butt of the revolver came down hard on the side of his head. He staggered, a flash of white-hot pain exploding behind his eyes. He didn't fall. He turned, swinging a wild fist. The big man grunted and stumbled back. Pike stepped in, his movements fast and vicious. He drove his boot into Reed's stomach. Reed doubled over, gasping. The big man hit him again, a heavy, meaty fist to the jaw that snapped his head back. He fell to his knees. "This is a message," Pike said, his voice calm. He kicked Reed hard in the ribs. Reed heard a crack, and a new, sharp pain seared his side. "Leave town. Leave Mrs. May. Leave the dead to their graves. Or the next time, we won't stop at a beating." Reed was on the ground, curled up, trying to breathe through the fire in his chest. "Just to make sure you understand," Pike said. He pulled his pistol. He was not aiming at Reed. He was aiming at Reed's right hand, splayed on the dusty ground. Pike smiled. Then, a shot rang out. It was not Pike's pistol. It was the sharp, heavy crack of a rifle. A chip of wood exploded from the barrel Pike had been standing near, stinging his cheek. "Damnation! Get away from him!" Clara's voice screamed from the end of the alley. She was standing there, 20 yards away, the Winchester at her shoulder, her face a white mask of fury. Pike and the big man stared. They had not counted on the woman. Clara fired again. The bullet kicked up dust at their feet. "I won't miss again!" The big man grabbed Pike's arm. "She's crazy! Harlan, let's go!" Pike cursed, his face dark with anger. He looked at Reed, then at Clara. "This ain't over," he spat. They ran, disappearing into the dark of the far street. Clara ran to Reed, her boots skidding in the dirt. She dropped the rifle, falling to her knees beside him. "Reed! Oh, God! Reed!" He was trying to get up, coughing. Blood dripped from his mouth. "I'm all right," he gasped. The words a lie. "You are not," she said, her voice shaking. She looped an arm under his, trying to lift him. "Help me. We have to get you back." It was a slow, agonizing trip. He leaned on her, every step a fresh wave of pain. She was strong, but he was a dead weight. By the time they got him up the stairs and into the room, they were both shaking, covered in his blood and the alley's filth. She got him onto the bed. He lay there, his eyes closed, his breathing shallow and quick. "Don't move," she ordered. She barred the door, then lit the lamp. Her hands were trembling so badly it took 3 matches. She poured water from the pitcher into the basin. She gently, so gently, began to clean his face. His lip was split wide open. His left eye was already swelling shut. A deep gash was on his temple. "He kicked me," Reed breathed, his hand going to his side. "Ribs." She unbuttoned his shirt, pulling the bloody, torn fabric away. A massive, dark bruise was already forming over his side. She prodded gently. He cried out, a sharp, choked sound. "They're broken," she whispered. She tore a sheet into strips. "I have to bind them. It's going to hurt." "Just do it," he gasped. She wrapped his chest, her hands moving with a practiced, desperate tenderness. He was sweating, his body rigid with pain. but he did not make another sound. When she was done, she sat on the edge of the bed. She just looked at him, at what they had done to him. The adrenaline was gone, leaving a cold, terrible fear. "We should go," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Pike was right. We should just run." Reed opened his one good eye. He looked at her. "No, not now." "He'll kill you, Reed," she said, and now the tears she had held back started to fall. They ran down her face, unchecked. "He'll kill you, and it will be for nothing. They beat you. They beat you, and I can't watch another man die. I can't." She was sobbing, her hands covering her face. "I was so scared. I thought they'd shot you. I got there, and I thought you were dead." He reached out, his good hand finding her arm. He gripped it. "Clara." "I love you," she whispered, the words torn from her. She looked at him, her eyes drowning in tears. "God help me, I love you, and it scares me more than Granger does, because they're going to take you from me, and I won't survive it again. I won't." It was the first time the word had been spoken. It hung in the hot, still room, heavier than the scent of blood. Reed stared at her. He saw her love, and he saw her terror, and he knew she was right. They would kill him. The law was a joke. The fight was unwinnable. Unless he changed the rules. He pulled himself up, a deep groan of pain forced from his lips. "Clara, listen to me." "Reed, don't lie down." "No, listen, Pritchard was right. We don't have evidence. Granger's office. It's in the bank." "What?" She wiped her eyes, confused. "He's arrogant," Reed said, his voice a low rasp. "He's a businessman. He keeps records. He has to— What if he kept the letter from Evans? What if he kept something?" "You can't," she said, her face pale. "Reed, you can't even stand. You're not going to break into the bank." "I am," he said. "The law won't help. We have to help ourselves. He'll be at the saloon, celebrating, telling Pike what a good job he did. It's the only way." "You'll be caught. It's a hanging offense." "It's a hanging offense either way," he said. He looked at her, his one good eye fierce. "He thinks he's broken me. He thinks I'm done. He won't be looking for me. Not tonight." He waited. It was past midnight. The town was dead. The only sound was the tinny piano from the saloon, 2 streets over. He had watched from the window. He saw Granger, Pike, and the big man go in 2 hours ago. "I'm going," he said. He stood, his whole body screaming. Clara had wrapped his ribs so tight he could barely breathe. "I'm going with you," she said, picking up the rifle. "I'll watch the street." He did not argue. He knew he needed her. They moved like ghosts. He was a shadow, limping, holding his side. She was his guard, the rifle held ready, scanning the dark. The back of the bank had one window, leading to a storage room. Reed used his knife, prying at the lock. It was old. It splintered. He slipped inside. Clara took up a position across the street, hidden in the deep shadow of a doorway. The bank was dark. Reed moved by touch. He found the stairs. Granger's office was on the 2nd floor. The door was locked. He put his shoulder into it. The pain in his ribs was a white-hot flash, but the wood gave way. He was in— The room smelled of cigar smoke and leather. A large oak desk sat by the window. He lit a single match. He had to find it. He went straight to the desk. He pulled the drawers. Ledgers, loan papers, deeds. One drawer was locked. He used the knife again, splintering the wood, and pulled it open. Inside, personal papers and a stack of letters, tied with a ribbon. The match burned his fingers. He dropped it, cursing, and lit another. He pulled the ribbon. A letter fell out. The handwriting was not Evans's. It was a scrawl, an anonymous note. He read it. "I saw what you did, Mr. Granger. I saw you meet the doc.
I know what you paid him for. The woman is dead. That's murder. Reed's heart hammered. He lit another match. There was more. You want me to keep quiet. It costs $200. Leave it at the old mission fence, or the whole town hears about your merciful end. It was a blackmail letter. Granger had kept it. Reed looked at the bottom of the page. There, pressed into the cheap paper, was a dark, greasy smudge, an inky thumbprint, left by the man who had written it. But wait, near the top, where Granger would have held it to read, was another, fainter print, a partial, smudged with what looked like cigar ash. This was not enough. He dug deeper, another match, and then he saw it. Not a letter, a receipt, a bank draft. Pay to Dr. A. Evans. For services rendered. Amount $500. And at the bottom, the signature, Abel Granger. $500 for a country doctor. That was a lifetime. It was a price for silence. He took the receipt. He took the blackmail letter. He limped from the office. They did not wait for morning. They went straight to the magistrate's house. Reed hammered on the door until a light came on. Magistrate Hennessy opened the door in his nightshirt, a shotgun in his hands. Calhoun, what in God's name? Reed pushed past him, Clara at his back. He threw the papers on the man's dining table. That's a bank draft, $500, paid to the doctor who pronounced my wife dead, 2 weeks after her death, and that's a letter from someone who saw him pay the doctor. Hennessy read the papers. His face went pale. This was taken from his office. This is theft. Calhoun. And this is murder. Hennessy! Reed's voice was a roar. I was beaten in an alley tonight by his man, Pike. He broke my ribs. He was going to cripple me. You're the law. Now, are you going to do your job? Or are you on his payroll, too? Now, you listen here. No, you listen! Clara stepped forward, her voice ringing with a cold fury. Abel Granger murdered Reed's wife. He murdered my husband, Silas May, and he sent his men to beat this man, and he threatened me. We have the diary, we have the draft, we have the letter. The law in this territory might be weak, Magistrate, but it ain't blind, and the people of this town ain't stupid. You call a hearing. You bring Granger in, or we will stand on the street in the morning and we will read these letters to every man, woman, and child in Dust Hollow, and we'll see who they believe. Hennessy looked at Clara's blazing eyes. He looked at Reed's bruised, bloody, determined face. He was not just looking at two victims. He was looking at a force of nature. Public opinion was a fickle thing, and murder was bad for business. He sighed, his shoulders slumping. All right, in the morning. I'll convene a hearing. 10 o'clock. But God help you both if this ain't what it looks like. It's what it looks like, Reed said. They left. They did not go back to the boarding house. They sat on the steps of the courthouse, Reed holding his side, Clara holding her rifle. They sat together, and they waited for the dawn. Word spread through Dust Hollow like fire. By 9 o'clock, the small courthouse was packed. Granger was there, in a clean suit, his face a mask of polite confusion. Pike and the big man stood at the back, their arms crossed. The hearing was a sham. Granger's lawyer, a slick man from Tucson, tore the evidence apart. The diary was a fantasy. The draft was a payment for outstanding medical services. The blackmail letter was a forgery, a desperate act by a grieving, violent man. He pointed to Reed's beaten face, a man who clearly picks fights in alleys and now seeks to blame a respected businessman for his own thuggery. But the people were watching. They were listening. They had seen Granger buy up the valley. They had seen him squeeze them. And now they were looking at him differently. The whispers had changed. The magistrate, sweating, called a recess. I'll review the testimony. I'll issue a finding tomorrow. It was a stall. Reed knew it. Granger knew it. Granger was furious. He was being questioned. His power was being challenged.
He strode from the courthouse, his face black. He looked at Reed. It was not a look of anger. It was a look of judgment, a death sentence. Reed and Clara walked out into the street. They were exhausted. They had not won. They had only survived. "We need to get back to the ranch," Clara said. "We need to—" "Fire!" a man was shouting, pointing out of town, toward the ridge. "There's a fire, out on the ridge line." Clara's hand went to her mouth. "No." Reed grabbed her arm. They ran for the horses. They rode. They rode as fast as the animals could carry them. Reed's ribs were a constant, searing agony, but the fear was worse. They topped the last rise, and they stopped. It was gone. The entire ranch was an inferno. The cabin was a roaring pillar of flame. The barn, the lean-to, the fences, all of it. Harlan Pike had not waited. Granger had given the order. The house where Silas had lived, where she had hidden, where she and Reed had come together. It was collapsing in on itself, a shower of sparks rising to the black, smoky sky. They sat on their horses, helpless, watching it all burn. All of it. Clara slid from the mule. Her legs gave out. She sank to her knees in the dirt, her face utterly blank, just watching the flames consume her life. The ashes, black and gray, began to settle on her hair. Reed dismounted, his body screaming in protest. He limped to her. He knelt in the dirt and mud beside her. He pulled her to him, his arms wrapping around her as she stared, silent and broken, at the fire. He held her as the roof fell in, a great, whooshing roar. He was crying, not from pain, not from loss. He was crying from a rage so deep it had no sound. They had taken everything. Esther, Silas, and now this. He grabbed her face, his hands rough, forcing her to look away from the flames, to look at him. Her face was smudged with soot, her eyes wide and hollow. "Clara," he said, his voice a raw tear. "He's left us nothing, nothing." He held her, his grip desperate. "If we live through this, if we survive him, you'll be my wife, won't you? You'll marry me." She stared at him, her lips parted. The firelight danced in her wide, wet eyes. She was covered in the ashes of her past. She did not answer. She said nothing. She just lifted a trembling, soot-stained hand. She did not touch his face. She gripped his hand. She laced her fingers through his, her hold as tight as a vice. Her eyes, shining in the firelight, were not hollow anymore. They were blazing. The fire burned for a full day. Reed and Clara sat on the ridge, wrapped in their blankets, and watched it die. They did not speak. There was nothing to say. The smoke, a thick black plume that rose into the clear Arizona sky, was a signal. It was an epitaph for their old lives and a declaration of war. When the last embers had cooled, leaving a field of black timbers and gray ash, they rode back to Dust Hollow. They did not go to the boarding house. They rode straight to the courthouse, their faces smeared with soot, their eyes red-rimmed and hard as granite. Reed was still clutching the bank draft and the blackmail letter. They did not have to say a word. The town was already gathered. The fire on the ridge, visible for 20 miles, had been seen by everyone. They had seen Granger ride out of town in a fury. They had seen Harlan Pike and his man ride out right after, and they had not seen them return. The equation was simple: arson. When Reed and Clara rode into the street, a path cleared. The whispers were gone. The judgmental looks were gone. The townspeople looked at the soot-covered pair, at Reed's bruised and broken face, at Clara's silent, blazing fury, and they felt shame. Abel Granger was in the saloon, drinking, Magistrate Hennessy, his face pale and his hands shaking, went in himself to get him. He was not alone. Amos Pritchard, the old lawyer, was with him, and behind him were half a dozen men, ranchers and townsfolk, no longer on Granger's payroll, and no longer afraid. The second hearing was not a hearing. It was a reckoning. It was held in the street, in the white-hot light of the sun, Pritchard, his voice no longer weary, laid it out. He held up the diary. He called this a fantasy. He held up the bank draft. He called this a payment for services. He held up the blackmail note. He called this a forgery. Then he pointed to the column of smoke, still visible on the horizon. And what do you call that, Mr. Granger? A business expense? A low growl bumbled through the crowd. This man, Pritchard shouted, pointing at Granger, tried to force Silas May from his land. And when he refused, Silas May was shot in the back. This man tried to force Reed Calhoun from his land. And when he refused, his sick wife died under mysterious, merciful circumstances, paid for with $500. And when Mr. Calhoun and Mrs. May came here seeking justice, his men beat Mr. Calhoun in an alley and burned Mrs. May's home to the ground. Lies, Granger roared, but his voice was tight with panic. He looked for Pike. He looked for the sheriff. The sheriff was staring at his own boots. Where is Dr. Evans, Mr. Granger? Someone shouted from the crowd. Where's Harlan Pike? Shouted another. The man who had written the blackmail letter, a small, nervous ex-clerk named Silas, had fired, was pushed to the front. He was terrified, but he was more terrified of his neighbors than he was of Granger. I wrote it, the clerk stammered. I saw him. I saw Granger pay the doctor. I saw it all. That was all it took. The dam of fear broke. Granger's power, built on the assumption that no one would ever dare to speak, evaporated in the street. He was a king with no subjects. He was not arrested for murder. The proof was circumstantial, the doctor gone, the witnesses cowards. But he was arrested for fraud, for conspiracy, for arson. The bank was seized by the magistrate. Its books opened. It was a house of cards. He had been using the threat of the railroad to buy land for pennies, while holding fraudulent loans over the entire town. The legal battle dragged on for weeks, but Granger was finished. He was a prisoner in the town he had once owned. He sold everything to pay his debts, to pay the lawyer from Tucson, to avoid a rope. In the end, he was left with nothing but his fine suit. Magistrate Hennessy, anxious to prove his own authority, signed the order. Abel Granger was banished from the territory. Reed and Clara stood on the boardwalk and watched him ride out of town on a sway-backed mule, the same way he had forced so many others to leave. He did not look at them. He just looked at the dust. The land was theirs, what was left of it. The magistrate, in a public show of restitution, issued a new deed. The Calhoun claim and the May homestead were combined. One parcel, one title. It was made out in both their names, Reed Calhoun and Clara May. They stood on the ridge, the paper in Reed's hand. The smell of ash was still thick in the air. The house was gone. The barn was a skeleton of charred beams. The stone chimney stood alone, like a tombstone. It's all gone, Clara whispered. There was no joy in the victory. Not all of it, Reed said, his voice quiet. He knelt, his broken ribs aching, and scooped up a handful of the blackened earth. He didn't get the land. He didn't get the water. He looked at her, and he didn't get us. He let the ash fall from his hand. Let's go to work. They started with the barn. It was the only thing salvageable. They lived in the one corner that still had a roof, sleeping on a pile of hay they'd cut from the north pasture. They had nothing, no money, no tools, save what Reed had carried in his saddlebag. But the town, ashamed, began to help. One day, a wagon appeared, unannounced. It was the liveryman. He left a crate. Inside was a hammer, a saw, a bag of nails, and a side of bacon. He did not stay to be thanked. The wife of the dry goods owner, the same one who had whispered against Clara, came next. She left a bundle of blankets, 2 iron skillets, and a bag of flour. She looked at Clara, her face stiff, and said, "A body needs to stay warm." It was the only apology she could make. Reed and Clara worked from sunup to sundown. Rebuilding was a slow, painful, beautiful thing. They cleared the rubble of the house. Every charred piece of wood, every broken dish, was a memory. Clara found a fragment of a blue china plate Silas had bought her. She held it for a long time, then set it on the base of the chimney. Reed found a metal button, melted and warped. He did not know if it was from his own clothes or from hers. It did not matter. They began to build. They did not have the logs for a full cabin, so they salvaged. They pulled the half-burnt beams from the barn. They hauled stones from the creek bed. They built the new house around the one thing that had survived, the stone chimney. The work was a new language between them. He would lift a beam, his side screaming in protest, and she would be there to steady it. She would mix the mud and straw for the chinking, and he would pack it into the walls, his rough hands working beside hers. They learned the rhythm of each other. They learned the quiet strength in her back. He learned the stubborn set of her jaw when a stone would not fit. She learned the patience in his hands, how he could take a warped piece of wood and make it straight. They were living as man and wife, the shared pallet in the barn, the danger, the fear. It had bonded them in a way no ceremony could. The intimacy that had begun in terror had softened into a deep, abiding comfort. There was no shame. There was no awkwardness. He would come in from cutting timber, and she would be there with a dipper of water. She would wash his shirt, her hands brushing against his skin, and it was a simple, necessary touch. They were partners. They were equals. They were survivors. The house grew, a floor, walls, a roof. It was smaller than the old one. It was rougher, but it was theirs. One afternoon, months later, the last shingle was on the roof. They were building the porch, the one place they both had missed, the place where their story had truly begun. A storm was building, but it was not the angry, violent kind. The sky turned a soft, pearly gray. A low rumble of thunder sounded in the distance, and then a light rain began to fall. It was a soft, cleansing shower, the kind that settles the dust and makes the air smell sweet. Clara was sitting on the top step, her hands resting in her lap, watching the rain wash the construction dust from the new wood. Reed stood in the yard, letting the cool drops fall on his face. His ribs had healed, leaving only a dull ache. The scars on his face had faded. He looked at Clara, at the new house rising behind her, solid and strong. He looked at the land, which was already showing new shoots of green grass through the ash. He had asked her a question in the light of that fire. She had answered it by lacing her fingers through his. But it was not enough, not for her. She deserved more than an answer given in terror. He walked to the porch. He did not sit beside her. He stood in the rain, on the wet earth, and looked up at her. "Reed?" she asked, a small smile on her face. "You're getting soaked. Come out of the rain." "I asked you something," he said, his voice low. "That night, I asked you if you'd be my wife." Her smile faded. She just watched him, her eyes searching his. "I asked you when we had nothing," he said. "When we were covered in ash, I was a man asking out of fear. I don't want to be that man." He dropped to one knee. He knelt in the mud, in the gentle rain, and looked up at her. He had no ring. He had nothing to offer but the work of his hands and the life they had rebuilt. "Clara May," he said, his voice clear and steady. "I am not in pain. I am not in fear. I am not a ghost. I am a man, standing on the land we saved, and I am asking you, in the clean light of day, will you be my wife?" Clara's hand came up to her mouth. The tears that had been absent for so long, burned away by the fire, finally came. They were not tears of sadness. They were tears of the rain, of release. She slid off the step, kneeling in front of him, her knees in the mud. She did not say yes. She just put her arms around his neck, pulled his face to hers, and kissed him. It was a kiss that tasted of rain and mud and wood smoke and a future. It was the first kiss that held no memory of loss. It was all promise.
They were married on the hill. Not the hill where Esther was buried. That was miles away. A different life. They were married on the hill behind their new house, overlooking the valley. Reverend Matthias came out from town. He was an old man, and the ride was hard. But he came. He looked at the two of them, at Reed's steady eyes and Clara's quiet smile, and he understood. There was no one else. No music, no wine. Clara wore her one good calico dress, the one she had washed and mended. She had a braid of wildflowers in her hair. Reed wore a clean shirt. The Reverend read from his book, but the words were secondary. The real vows were the ones they had already made. In the fire, in the mud, in the building of the house. "Do you take this woman?" Reed looked at Clara. "I do," he said. "I will." "Do you take this man?" Clara looked at Reed, her eyes shining. "I do. I will." They were not two halves, made whole. They were two broken, jagged pieces, who had found a way to fit together, to build something new, strong at the broken places. That night, they were in their own house, in their own bed. Reed had built the frame from the straightest pine he could find. Clara had sewn a mattress ticking and stuffed it with fresh, sweet straw. The room was clean. It smelled of pine. A single candle burned on the nightstand, beside the one blue fragment of her old china. They lay facing each other, not touching, just looking. The silence was full. It was full of the work, the fight, the fear. It was full of Esther and Silas. Their ghosts were in the room, but they were no longer howling. They were quiet. They were at peace. Reed raised a hand and gently touched her face, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. She had survived. He had survived. They had found this. He pulled her to him. It was an embrace of such profound, quiet warmth that it seemed to melt the last of the scars. The desire that came was not the desperate, frantic need of their past. It was gentle. It was slow. It was a rediscovery, a way of learning each other without the shadow of death in the room. It was a promise, made with their bodies, that they would never be alone in the dark again. They lay tangled in the blankets, the candlelight soft on their skin. The rain had stopped. The desert night was clear and silent. Clara was nestled in the crook of his arm, her head on his chest. She listened to the steady, strong beat of his heart. "You're not in pain anymore, are you?" she whispered. Reed was quiet for a moment. He looked at the ceiling, at the beams he had set in place. He thought of Esther. He thought of the rage. He thought of the black, bottomless guilt. It was all still there. It would always be there. But it was not him anymore. It was just a part of the story. He looked down at the woman in his arms, at her hair, spilling over his shoulder. He felt the warmth of her breath against his skin. This was real. "Just remembering," he whispered, his voice thick and loving. The story ended, as so many do in the West, on a porch. It was months later. The garden was thriving. The paint was new on the window frames. Reed Calhoun and Clara May, Clara Calhoun now, stood, leaning against the rail. The sun was setting, a spectacular blaze of orange and purple and blood red that set the entire sky on fire. They were not the same two people. He was no longer the hollowed-out shell, adrift on the dust. She was no longer the cold, wary widow, guarding the past with a rifle. He reached for her hand. His was rough, scarred from the building. Hers was the same, strong and calloused, their fingers interlaced, a familiar, perfect fit. They watched the sun bleed into the horizon. Their eyes were wet. They were not tears of sadness. They were the tears of people who had looked into the fire and had not flinched. They were the tears of people who had lost everything, and in the ashes had found the courage to build it all back, together. In the brilliant fading light, they were not the broken. They were not the lost. They were the found. They were the ones who had dared, against all reason,
to love again. Thank you so much for listening to our story. Where in the world are you listening from? We'd love to hear from you. So please drop a comment below and let's connect. Be sure to subscribe to From Wild West. And if you enjoyed this tale, share your thoughts with us.